medicine, and work. We also have to make sure that we are working toward funding the government, avoiding a reckless, extreme MAGA Republican shutdown, and meeting the needs of the American people. House Democrats continue to be committed to putting people over politics and fighting for the things that matter, including lower costs, growing the middle class, and making sure we can live in the safest possible community in every single zip code. These are the issues that matter. And once again, we see that the Republicans could care less about meeting the needs of the American people. House Republicans have now been in the majority for a little under a year. They have nothing to show the American people that they have accomplished on behalf of the American people. Zero. Don't take my word for it. Just ask Chip Roy, who made it explicitly clear that the House Republican majority has done nothing to meet the needs of the American people. Instead, they continue to focus on undermining the health, the safety, and the economic well-being of the American people. What's the latest example this week? That they've been directed to prepare to repeal the Affordable Care Act. In other words, they want to take away, House Republicans have been directed to prepare to take away health care from more than 100 million Americans who are suffering, excuse me, from pre-existing conditions. House Republicans are going to spend today and tomorrow continuing their phony investigation of President Biden's family, and will try to impeach Secretary Mayorkas at the direction of one of the ringleaders of the extreme MAGA Republican circus in the House, Marjorie Taylor Greene. These are unserious individuals during very serious times, and it's hurting the American people. Questions?
Jeffries, good morning. Thank you. Obviously, the transgressions, the alleged transgressions by Mr. Santos are pretty serious here. But, people have some reservation about expelling somebody who's not been convicted. Did Democrats open the door on this type of thing with discipline against Ms. Greene a couple of years ago when Democrats were in the majority, Mr. Gosar, by not having a full process when they were penalized for their conduct, and did that crack the door open to possibly going this direction against Mr. Santos when he's not been convicted in a court of law?
Yeah, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Paul Gosar weren't subject to expulsion resolutions. They were held accountable for extreme, outrageous, and dangerous behavior. But they remain in this institution to this day. So there was no precedent that was set by House Democrats. And there's no precedent to the extent that George Santos is removed from the House of Representatives, other than if you are a unadulterated serial fraudster who has broken ethics laws, pled guilty to committing financial crimes in Brazil, and is facing a litany of accusations related to serious violations of federal law, then perhaps you should be held accountable in the House of Representatives. And there was a long and comprehensive ethics investigation with a report that was issued that is bipartisan in nature, unanimous in nature. Every single Republican and every single Democrat on the House Ethics Committee stands behind the ethics report, which has serious findings of wrongful, unethical, and likely criminal behavior. And so I expect that there'll be a bipartisan vote tomorrow, likely to expel George Santos, but at the moment that remains to be seen, and we'll see what happens on the floor.
Mr. Leader, are you urging your fellow Democrats to vote one way or another tomorrow?
We have no official whip recommendation. We recognize that this is an issue of conscience.
Congressman Aguilar indicated yesterday that House Democrats have not been kept abreast of the negotiations that are going on in the Senate about an immigration deal, maybe to unlock this funding for Ukraine and Israel. To what degree are you concerned that a product that might come out of those negotiations might be unacceptable to House Democrats?
Well, it's going to be very important that any resolution that is reached by the 6 Senate negotiators will ultimately be presented to the Senate Democratic Caucus, the Senate Republicans, and of course, House Democrats and Republicans to try to see if it's consistent with an agreement that can secure bipartisan support in both chambers. We've made clear, Leader Schumer has made clear, that any resolution with respect to the national security supplemental funding package has to be one that can secure strong Democratic support in the Senate and, of course, significant Democratic support in the House. And I look forward to a product being presented to us, which we will then review, discuss as House Democrats in a caucus meeting, and figure out our perspective as to whether we can support it.
Have you given Senator Schumer anything that would be red lines for House Democrats, any guidance about what you think your caucus could not accept?
I have not. There are member-to-member communications with some of the Senate negotiators on the Democratic side. I expect that should intensify and continue. We have said that publicly and privately that any resolution of any border security measures has to be consistent with our values as House Democrats. And our view has been that we are a nation of immigrants, and that will continue to be important as a value for us because it's an American value. We are also a nation anchored in the rule of law, and that will continue to be important as we evaluate whatever comes out of the Senate.
Some of your colleagues are discussing the idea of placing conditions on U.S. aid to Israel, and I'm wondering if you think that that is a legitimate, healthy conversation for Congress to have, or if that is beyond the pale.
My view is that we've got to make sure Israel and our allies across the world are able to provide for their self-defense in the face of terror, in the case of Israel, or authoritarian overreach, in the case of Ukraine, facing down Russian aggression, and that we should be there for our allies. And of course, continue to urge anyone throughout the world, but particularly those that we support, to prosecute the conflicts that they are engaged in a manner consistent with the international rules of war. And it's my expectation that that will continue, and certainly the Biden administration will continue to make that clear.
Mr. Leader, there's an undiagnosed pneumonia that's spreading in China right now. It's causing hospitalizations despite, is there remaining concern for the Democrat caucus of the lack of transparency about the illness coming out of China?
I'm not familiar with that, but I certainly look forward to looking into it.
Thank you, Mr. Leader. So at noon, Santos, he plans to introduce a privilege motion to expel Congressman Jamal Bowman for pulling a fire alarm. What do you say to that?
Well, the Ethics Committee decisively acted with respect to the situation with Jamal Bowman and indicated that no further Ethics Committee action was necessary. So there's no basis for George Santos, who's a joke and an embarrassment and a serial fraudster, to move forward with any resolution or to take him seriously at all. Question that we should all be asking is, why is George Santos still around? Like, House Republicans knew a lot about George Santos before he was elected. And we have reason to believe, either intentionally kept that information out of the public domain or willfully turned a blind eye. And then when the information exploded into the public domain, continued to coddle George Santos and play footsie with him for the better part of the year. Why? Because House Republicans needed George Santos's vote. And that is the reason, in part, that George Santos remains an important part of the House Republican Conference, along with his best buddy, Marjorie Taylor Greene. Thank you.
Leader Jeffries, Basil John with Next Star. Santos had mentioned earlier in his press conference that the words that he used was that he was bullied out of his position. He is fairly sure that he will be voted out of Congress. Do you think that if Congressman Santos had actually cooperated more with the ethics investigation, there would have been a chance for him to at least keep his seat, or do you think that this was inevitable?
I think it's time to end one part of the extreme MAGA Republican three-ring circus that has been visited upon the American people in ways that undermine the health, the safety, and the economic well-being of the American people, because extreme MAGA Republicans have done nothing to make life better for everyday Americans, and, if anything, are trying to jam their extreme right-wing policy priorities down the throats of the American people in ways that would be harmful. And so George Santos is a malignant distraction, and hopefully that issue gets resolved. But the problem within the extreme MAGA Republican House majority will still remain, because extreme MAGA Republicans have no vision, have no agenda, and have no track record to solve problems for hardworking American taxpayers. They've done nothing, even though the American people are facing serious problems. And President Biden has made clear throughout the year, and House Democrats have made clear, that we are ready, willing, and able to work with our Republican colleagues in a bipartisan fashion to get things done whenever and wherever possible in order to make life better for the American people. But we need partners who are serious in order to do that, and to date, that has largely been lacking.
Do you think this will affect the New York 3 seat at all?
I do not.
Leader Jeffries?
Yep.
There's a bipartisan push to create a bipartisan bicameral debt commission. Speaker backs this idea, something that could be added to a spending bill early next year. What do you think of that idea? Would you vote for it?
We haven't had that conversation within the House Democratic Caucus family, and so I'm not going to get out ahead of that discussion. But there are real concerns that any so-called commission being backed by the extreme MAGA Republicans is part of a backdoor way of trying to gut Social Security and Medicare. Because what we've seen year after year, in fact, decade after decade, is that the House Republican agenda is pretty clear. Slash Social Security, end Medicare as we know it, and blow up the Affordable Care Act. And from time to time, including most recently by the former insurrectionist in chief, say the quiet part out loud. And so there'll be some concerns relative to any proposal being backed by the House Republicans, but there are members in good faith on our side of the aisle who do want to have a discussion about making sure that Social Security and Medicare can continue to be an important part of the fabric of the great American dream, and to ensure that we can continue to be fiscally responsible as we provide for the needs of the American people. It's the other side of the aisle that talks about fiscal responsibility, but continues to actually blow up our debt and our deficit, while Democrats, including under President Bill Clinton, President Barack Obama, and now President Joe Biden, are the party that actually has reduced deficits and in the case of President Clinton, turned a deficit into a surplus. And every single time the Republicans gain control of the House and or the Senate, what they do is they jam big tax cuts for the wealthy, the well-off, and the well-connected down the throats of the American people, as they did with the GOP tax scam, where 83% of the benefits went to the wealthiest 1% here in America, and they saddled our children and grandchildren with $2 trillion worth of unnecessary debt. That's the Republican record on fiscal responsibility. The same thing was done under President Ronald Reagan, and the same thing was done under President George W. Bush. That's their record. So we'll evaluate any legislative proposal on the merits, but there's deep reason to be concerned because my Republican colleagues don't have a record that indicates any seriousness with respect to fiscal responsibility.
You're talking about the impeachment investigation moving forward with House Republicans. Can you talk about the Democratic response and how you guys are preparing to combat the claims you'll be making?
There's not a scintilla of evidence that Republicans have produced to show that President Joe Biden has engaged in wrongdoing, an impeachable offense, or in any way has broken the law. Why? Because there is no evidence that exists to implicate President Joe Biden in anything nefarious. President Biden is a good man. He's a good and decent and hardworking man, and that's been his entire life in public service. So this is all part of a phony effort by extreme MAGA Republicans to distract the American people because they have no track record of accomplishment, no vision for the future, or no plan to solve problems for hardworking American taxpayers. And so we will continue to point that out. Thanks.
Following an earlier thread, Santos has already said he'll file an expulsion resolution against Jamal Bowman. Is there a concern among Democratic colleagues that with the expulsion of Santos likely tomorrow, that this could open the door for expulsion to be weaponized against lawmakers in the future?
Well, there's an appropriately high bar for expulsion that requires 2/3 of the body in order for an expulsion resolution to be successful, and there is zero likelihood that any resolution brought by George Santos or anyone else on the extreme MAGA Republican side, simply for political purposes, will receive a single Democratic vote, let alone a significant number of Democratic votes, which would be necessary in order to hit the 2/3 threshold. Thanks. I'll get you in.
The Ethics Committee often takes some criticism around here for moving too slowly, but the resolution coming up tomorrow was introduced by the chair of the Ethics Committee, and you nodded to the report earlier. I mean, do you think this means that the process worked as intended?
I think the Ethics Committee tried to do the best job that it could, issued a very thorough report. The chair of the Ethics Committee clearly stands by that report, and members will evaluate it on the merits in connection with the expulsion of George Santos.
Question on the return to the border, Ukraine. I mean, do you see middle ground there? Do you think that Ukraine bill could get done this year?
The Ukraine bill absolutely needs to be done this year, and the reason why we're in this situation in terms of not funding the continuation of the Ukrainian war effort is because there are members of the House Republican Conference who are part of a pro-Putin caucus. How unfortunate is that? That there are House Republicans actually rooting for Vladimir Putin to succeed. Don't take my word for it. Take their word for it. Repeated statements in the public domain. Inside the House of Representatives on the Republican side, and certainly outside of the House of Representatives by influencers of the extreme right wing, like the former president and Tucker Carlson.
So one of the things that Senate Republicans seem to be pushing when it comes to the negotiations on border security is raising the credible fear standards when it comes to those seeking asylum. Is that something you can bite on if it means getting some of what you're asking for?
Have not seen the specifics relative to that particular provision, but any changes that are made to our immigration system that are inconsistent with the principle of America as a nation of immigrants would raise serious concerns.
A question on New York's 3rd District, because if Santos is expelled, that means that there's going to be a special election scheduled in the next 3 months. Can you give the outlook for Democrats' ability to take that seat, and are you planning to endorse in the primary there, given that there are numerous candidates who are running?
Let's take one step at a time. We'll see what happens tomorrow in the context of the expulsion resolution. And then the process will be in the hands of both the Nassau County Democratic Party and the Queens County Democratic Party, at which point it will be my expectation that there will be some conversations between those two county organizations and stakeholders all across the congressional district and within New York's congressional delegation to chart a path forward so that New York's 3rd Congressional District can elect someone who's actually interested in solving problems, interested in putting people over politics, interested in making life better for the people on Long Island and Eastern Queens, as opposed to embarrassing them and embarrassing the nation. Last question?
To that point, though, I mean, if this is a plus Biden 8th district swung to +8 for Santos, you're confident Democrats can win it back. And the fact that we have heard relatively little from Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, who of course endorsed him, the top Republican from New York, just any thoughts on that?
Well, George Santos is a national embarrassment, but clearly an embarrassment to New York Republicans, an embarrassment to the people who stood by George Santos and helped elect him, like the House Republican Conference Chair, who bragged publicly about the significant amounts of money that were raised by her and New York Republicans in order to elect a serial fraudster. And it's going to be up to Democrats to now clean up the mess in New York's 3rd Congressional District that the Republican Party left behind. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
What's going on?
But Santos announced he was resigning.
Oh, really?
I keep pitching. I know. I keep pitching that story so that I don't have to do it.
No, he's gonna go out in flames. It's gonna be. Oh, I'm gonna get lunch now instead.
Oh, I got 2 hours.
I got a muffin and I got fruit. Yeah. Maybe. I'm gonna get a salad. I need to pay attention
Oh yeah, at noon.
He's gonna be doing his,
I love this guy. He's so funny. So I took my deck.